Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are doing something that feels a little bit like we're pulling back the curtain on reality itself.
It does feel like that.
Usually, we look at the external world, we're talking about tech trends, history, shifting geopolitics. But today, we are turning the lens inward. We are looking at the lens itself. We're going to talk about the world inside your head versus the reality that, well, actually exists outside of it.
Is a fascinating distinction, and honestly, it's a bit of an unsettling one. We all walk around every single day convinced that we are rational observers of the universe.
Totally. We think we see risks, we calculate the odds.
We look at the data and we make decisions based on, cold, hard facts. But the stack of research we have on the table today suggests that this self-image is, well, it's largely an illusion.
It's a total matrix moment. You think you're seeing the world as it is, but you're actually seeing a simulation that's been constructed by your own biology.
In a way, yes. And that simulation is built on shortcuts. Massive, massive shortcuts.
So here's the premise for today's deep dive. We like to think we are logical, data-driven decision makers. But the truth is, our brains are taking these huge shortcuts every second of the day.
Right. And these shortcuts, while they were great for keeping us alive on the savannah when we were running from lions,
Yeah, super useful then.
they are wreaking absolute havoc on how we deal with modern risks.
Precisely. So the mission for this discussion is to unpack exactly why we fear the wrong things. Why do we lie awake at night worrying about things that are statistically, incredibly unlikely to hurt us?
While completely ignoring the mundane, silent killers that are actually dangerous.
Exactly. And more importantly, and this is where it gets really heavy, how do these personal glitches in our thinking, how do they scale up to dictate public policy, laws, and where our tax money goes?
Because if we are all sort of hallucinating the risk, then the government is hallucinating the risk too.
The government is just a collection of human brains, after all.
That's all it is. Primate brains trying to make sense of spreadsheets.
To guide us through this, we are looking at a stack of research centered on the psychology of risk. We're pulling heavily from a specific chapter on availability, emotion, and risk, which synthesizes the work of some absolute heavy hitters in the field.
I mean, these are the titans of behavioral economics and risk analysis.
Yeah.
We're talking about economists like Howard Kuhnreuther and psychologists like Paul Slovic, Sarah Lichtenstein, Baruch Fischoff.
And the legal scholar Cass Sunstein. These are the people who didn't just study how we think, they completely reshaped how we understand human judgment.
It really did. They're the ones who prove that we aren't rational actors in that classic economic sense. We're messy, emotional, story-driven creatures.
And the hook here, the thing that really grabbed me when I was reading through this, is this tension between what feels safe and what feels risky. Like, why do we ignore a lethal threat like asthma, which kills a ton of people, but we panic about something like botulism?
Which kills almost no one.
Right. Or why does a technology that is actually quite safe feel incredibly risky just because we don't like the idea of it?
And it really all comes down to two main mechanisms in the brain: availability and emotion. And when those two get together, they create a version of reality that could be very, very different from the statistics.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with the first big concept, the foundation of this entire house of cards, the availability heuristic.
The availability heuristic is, it's essentially a rule of thumb our brains use to figure out how likely something is to happen.
A mental shortcut.
The ultimate mental shortcut. It basically says that we judge the frequency or the probability of an event by how easily we can recall examples of it.
So if I can think of it easily, my brain just assumes it happens all the time.
Exactly. Ease of recall becomes a proxy for probability. If you can easily bring an image or a story to mind, your system one, that fast, intuitive gut reaction part of your brain, just assumes it must be important and frequent.
Which makes total sense if you're a hunter-gatherer.
Right.
If I can easily remember a tiger attacking someone at the watering hole, it's probably a very good idea to be afraid of that watering hole.
It's incredibly efficient for physical survival in a simple environment. But when you apply that same hardware to the modern world, with its complex, abstract risks, well, it gets messy.
So how does this play out in the real world?
This brings us to the work of the economist Howard Kuhnreuther. He spent his career studying risk in insurance markets. And insurance is basically the business of pricing risk. So you'd expect people to be pretty rational about it.
You would think. I mean, it's a math problem. If I live on a fault line, I should buy earthquake insurance. Simple.
But Kuhnreuther found that isn't what happens at all. Instead, insurance purchases are driven almost entirely by availability. by recent memory. He looked specifically at Californians and earthquakes.
And what was the pattern he found there?
Well, imagine a big earthquake hits. For a little while immediately after the disaster, the victims, and this is key, even the near victims who just felt the shake but didn't lose their house, they become incredibly diligent.
Suddenly, risk is the only thing on their mind.
It is front and center. They rush out to buy insurance. They finally get around to tying down their hot water heaters to prevent fires. They seal their basement doors against future floods. They maintain their emergency kits perfectly.
Because the disaster is available. It's right there in 4K resolution in their memory.
It's vivid. The neural pathways are just blazing.
Right.
But here's the catch. Memories fade. And as the time goes on, the image of the shaking ground and the broken glass becomes less available. It gets harder to recall with that same emotional punch.
And as the memory dims,
So does the worry. And so does the diligence.
people stop checking the emergency kit.
Exactly. They let their insurance policies lapse. Kuhnreuther describes this as a recurrent cycle of disaster, followed by intense concern and then a growing, creeping complacency. We only prepare when the memory is fresh and painful.
So we aren't actually assessing the risk of the next earthquake. We're just reacting to the memory of the last one.
Precisely. And the crazy thing is, the geology hasn't changed. The fault line is still there. In fact, you could argue that right after a major earthquake, some pressure has been released, so you might be statistically a little safer for a while.
But that's when you're most afraid.
That's when you're terrified. And then 10 years later, when the pressure is built back up and you should be afraid, you've forgotten. So you cancel the insurance. It's perfectly irrational.
That is just wild. It's like we are completely out of sync with reality.
We are. And this connects to a really profound point Kuhnreuther makes about what he calls the worst-case fallacy.
Okay.
The source material mentioned a fascinating historical parallel with ancient Egypt.
Yes, looking at the Nile floods, that was fascinating.
Right. So in pharaonic Egypt, the entire society depended on the Nile. They tracked the high water mark of the river religiously. They knew it flooded periodically. So when they built their defenses, their levees, their elevated cities, how high do you think they built them?
They built them to handle the worst flood they'd ever seen.
Exactly. They looked at the worst flood that had happened so far and assumed that was the worst flood possible.
Which is a massive, massive gamble.
It's a huge logical flaw. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it can't. But psychologically, humans have a block. We struggle to imagine a disaster worse than what we have already seen.
The image just doesn't come to mind.
It doesn't. It's not in our memory bank. So we treat the unprecedented as if it's impossible. We anchor to our own limited experience.
That is genuinely terrifying. It feels like we are basically driving forward at 100 miles an hour while staring only into the rearview mirror.
And that rearview mirror is distorted and cracked. We are always preparing for the last war, the last flood, the last financial crash. We rarely prepare for the one that breaks the record because the record-breaking event isn't available to our imagination.
So that explains why we are so bad at preparing for things we have experienced or that our community has. But what about things we haven't experienced personally? Most of the risks I worry about. Plane crashes, terrorism, weird diseases, I haven't actually lived through them.
That is the perfect question. And it leads us right into the next section. If you haven't experienced it directly, where does the availability come from?
It has to come from somewhere else.
It comes from the media. And this is where our internal statistics get completely, utterly warped.
The source material discusses these groundbreaking studies that were done in Eugene, Oregon. This was the work of Slovic, Lichtenstein, and Fischoff.
This is some of the most influential work in the history of risk perception.
Yeah.
They wanted to see just how bad the public was at estimating causes of death. They had a hunch we were off, but they didn't know by how much.
So they set up an experiment. They asked participants to look at pairs of causes of death, things like what is more frequent, diabetes or asthma, and then they had to estimate the ratio.
And the results were, frankly, shocking. They compared what the public guessed to the actual health statistics of the time.
I have the numbers here, and I really want to read a few of these because they are absolutely wild. And I want you to explain what's happening in our brains with each one. Let's start with strokes versus accidents. And by accidents, we mean all accidents, car crashes, falls, everything.
Okay, so logically, just think about it. Strokes are a leading cause of death, especially as we get older. In reality, strokes cause almost twice as many deaths as all accidents combined.
Twice as many. But in the study, a staggering 80% of the respondents believed accidents were more likely.
80% got it wrong. Not just a little wrong, but fundamentally wrong.
So what's going on there? Why?
Think about the availability. An accident is often visible, it's dramatic, it's violent. You see car crashes on the side of the road, you see them on the evening news.
Right. It's an event.
It's an event. A stroke. A stroke happens behind closed doors. It happens in a hospital room or a bedroom. It's quiet.
Yeah.
The biological process. It's not available to your mental eye in the same way.
Okay, here's another one. Tornadoes versus asthma.
Oh, this one is tragic. Asthma is responsible for 20 times more deaths than tornadoes. 20 times. It's not even in the same league.
But the participants in the study saw tornadoes as the more frequent killer.
Of course they did. Again, look at the imagery. A tornado is cinematic. It's a monster from the sky. It rips houses apart. It's on the Weather Channel in brilliant Doppler radar.
It's a spectacle.
It's a total spectacle. Asthma is internal. It's a silent, desperate struggle for breath. It's not visual. It doesn't make for compelling television.
Okay, this next one is my favorite. Lightning versus botulism. Now, botulism is a very rare form of food poisoning. Lightning is, well, lightning.
Lightning is actually 52 times more frequent as a cause of death than botulism. 52.
But people judged death by lightning as less likely than botulism.
They did. People thought the food poisoning was more dangerous than the bolt from the sky.
How is that even possible?
This is likely because of a few high-profile news stories over the years about botulism outbreaks in, say, canned food. Those stories were terrifying. The idea of your own food turning against you is a primal fear. The story stuck. It became highly available, even though the event itself is incredibly rare.
It's the novelty.
The novelty and the horror.
Okay. And the grand finale, accidents versus diabetes.
This is the one that really highlights the scale of the distortion. Accidents were judged to be more than 300 times more likely than death by diabetes.
So 300 times.
300. The true ratio is 1 to 4. Diabetes kills 4 times as many people as all accidents combined.
That's not just a distortion, that's a different reality. We're walking around with a map of the world in our heads that is completely fundamentally wrong.
It's a fantasy map.
We think accidents and tornadoes and botulism are these massive threats, and we basically ignore the silent killers like diabetes and asthma and strokes. It's like we're living in an action movie instead of a medical drama.
That's a great way to put it. And the experts argue that media coverage is the primary driver here. But it's not malicious necessarily, it's a feedback loop. The media covers what they call novelty and poignancy.
If it bleeds, it leads.
That's the old saying, and it's true. Editors are not necessarily trying to deceive us. They are responding to public demand. They're businesses. We, the public, are interested in the unusual, the dramatic, the violent.
And because we click on it and watch it, they give us more of it.
Right, and because we see it on the news constantly, it becomes available in our memory.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle of fear.
It is. Unusual events like a shark attack attract disproportionate attention. Consequently, we perceive them as being much less unusual than they really are. So the world in our heads becomes this distorted map drawn by emotional intensity and media prevalence, not by statistics.
So we've established that if we can remember it easily, we think it's risky. That's availability. But the source material makes a really important pivot here. It says it's not just about memory, it's about feeling.
Yes. This is where Paul Slovic, one of the key researchers we mentioned, took the research a step further. He had this realization that ease of recall, how easy it is to remember something, and emotion are inextricably linked.
Frightening thoughts just come to mind faster.
They jump to the front of the line. A boring thought about diabetes doesn't have the same get up and go as a terrifying thought about a plane crash. This insight led him to develop the concept of the affect heuristic.
Affect being the psychologist's word for emotion.
Right, a general feeling of goodness or badness. The affect heuristic is a classic instance of substitution. We've talked about substitution and other deep dives. It's when your brain gets a hard question and, without you even noticing, swaps it for an easy one.
So instead of asking the hard logical question, what do I think about the statistical data regarding this particular risk?
A question that requires work, research, system 2 thinking.
My brain just asks, how do I feel about this?
Exactly. Do I like it? Do I hate it? Do I have a gut reaction of fear or disgust or warmth? The answer to that easy emotional question serves as the answer to the hard calculation. Your system 2, the logical part of you, is lazy. It doesn't want to do the math. So it just lets system 1, the emotional gut feeling part, make the call.
This source mentions the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio here. He did some really interesting work on people with certain types of brain damage.
Damasio's work is absolutely fascinating. He studied people who had damage to the prefrontal cortex, specifically the parts of the brain that process emotion. Now you might think, oh, if they can't feel emotion, they must be perfectly logical, Spock-like decision makers.
Right, that's the stereotype. Pure rationality, no fear, no bias, just cold, hard logic.
But the complete opposite was true. Without the ability to feel emotion, they couldn't make good decisions at all. In fact, they could barely make any decisions. Their lives fell apart.
Really? How so?
They would get stuck in endless loops of logical analysis. The book mentions they would spend hours debating which color pen to use to sign a document or where to park their car. They could list the pros and cons of every option forever, but they couldn't feel which one was better.
They had no gut instinct to guide them.
Zero. Damasio showed that healthy fear and emotional tagging are necessary for survival.
Yeah.
We need that gut check to guide us toward what is good and away from what is bad. Emotion is the rudder.
So emotion isn't the villain here. We absolutely need it.
We need it. It's essential. But in the complex modern world, it can lead us astray. It works brilliantly for immediate physical threats. Snake bad, run away. It works much less well for complex policy decisions like nuclear energy or chemical regulation.
And Slovic proved this with a brilliant experiment about the correlation between risk and benefit.
Yes, this is the one that when you read it, it just clicks. It explains so much about public debates.
Because in my head and in the real world, I know how things work. High risk, high reward.
Exactly. In economics, in the stock market, in almost every real-world scenario you can think of, risk and benefit are positively correlated. If you want high return, you buy a volatile stock. If you want the benefit of getting somewhere fast, you take the risk of driving a car.
You pay for the benefit with the risk. It's a trade-off.
But Slovic and his team found that in the human mind, the correlation is negative.
Meaning?
Meaning, if people liked a technology, if they had a positive feeling, a good affect toward it, they consistently rated it as having high benefit and low risk.
And if they disliked it, if they had a bad feeling about it?
They rated it as having low benefit and high risk.
Whoa. So in our heads, good things are pure good and bad things are pure bad. We completely refuse to accept that something we hate might have a real benefit or that something we love might actually be dangerous.
Exactly. The mind avoids what they call painful trade-offs. We want a tidy, imaginary world where we don't have to weigh the pros and cons. If we like nuclear power, we convince ourselves it's almost perfectly safe and the benefits are enormous. If we hate nuclear power, we convince ourselves it has almost no real benefit and the risks are apocalyptic.
There's no middle ground. There's no nuance.
None. The affect, the feeling, dictates the facts.
But they didn't stop there in the experiment. They actually tried to manipulate the participants, right?
This is the best part. This is where they really prove the mechanism. After the initial survey, the researchers gave the participants brief passages to read. One group read arguments emphasizing the benefits of a technology, say nuclear power. They didn't mention risk at all.
Just a little pamphlet saying, look how great and clean this energy is.
Right. And here's the twist. When people read about the high benefits, they went back and subconsciously lowered their estimate of the risks.
Even though they were given zero new information about the safety of the technology.
Zero. None whatsoever. The unconscious logic of the brain went something like this. I am hearing good things about this, therefore I like it, and since I like it, it must be safe. The feeling drove the perception of fact.
And I assume it worked the other way, too.
Yes. If they gave another group a passage that said the risks were actually very mild, those people suddenly developed a more favorable view of the benefits.
Wow. The source material has a great quote for this. The emotional tail wags the rational dog.
It's a perfect summary. We all like to think the dog, our rational mind, is in charge, leading the way. But most of the time, it's the tail, our emotions, our gut feelings, that is whipping us around. We decide how we feel, and then we retrofit the facts to match our feelings.
So this brings us to a major conflict. I mean, if the public is this irrational, if we're all being driven by vivid media stories and gut feelings, who should be in charge of keeping us safe?
This is the central question of risk regulation.
And it sets up what the source calls the great debate between two of the giants in this field, Paul Slovic, who we've been talking about, and Cass Sunstein.
This is a clash of philosophies. And it's not just academic, it's about democracy versus technocracy. Who gets to decide policy? The people or the experts?
Let's start with Paul Slovic. We've been discussing his research, but what is his stance on policy? He seems to be framed as the defender of the public.
He is. Slovic argues that while the public might be bad at statistics, we aren't stupid. He believes we're sensing legitimate distinctions that the experts, in their focus on numbers, tend to ignore.
What kind of distinctions?
Well, experts tend to look at one metric above all else,
Hmm.
body count. How many lives are lost? How many people died?
Which seems logical. I mean, a death is a death, isn't it?
It is logical, but it's sterile. It's a very narrow definition of risk. Slovic points out that the public cares deeply about how people die. We intuitively distinguish between good deaths and bad deaths.
Wait, what makes a death good? That sounds strange.
Well, not good in a happy sense, but
Yeah.
more acceptable, or at least understandable. A key distinction is voluntary versus involuntary risk.
Oh, okay. Like skiing versus pollution.
Exactly. Skiing is a voluntary risk. You choose to do it. If you get hurt, it's tragic, but it's part of the deal. Pollution from a factory that you live next to is an involuntary risk. It's imposed on you without your consent.
That makes sense. I'd be much angrier about a factory poisoning my water than I would be about breaking my leg on a ski slope, even if the ski slope is statistically way more dangerous.
Of course. The anger, the sense of injustice, is part of the risk. Slovic's big point is that risk is subjective. It doesn't exist out there in the universe as an objective fact. It's a concept we invented to help us cope with danger.
And because we invented it, how we define it is a choice.
It's a political and ethical choice. He gives examples of different ways you can measure risk, right? You can measure it as death per million people exposed. Or you could measure it as death per $1 million of product produced.
And those give you very different answers.
Very different. If you're a factory owner, you might prefer death per $1 million produced because it makes your factory look efficient and safe relative to its economic output. If you're a neighbor, you want death per million people because you don't care about the profit. You care about your life.
So for Slovic, defining risk is an exercise in power.
Exactly. And he strongly resists the idea that experts should just be able to impose their definition on us. He says we have to respect the public's intuition because that intuition reflects our values, our ideas about justice, consent, and dread, not just our math skills.
Okay, so that's Slovic. He says, listen to the people. Their fears are telling you something important about their values. In the other corner, we have Cass Sunstein. The source calls him the defender of rationality.
And it's a good title for him. Sunstein looks at the exact same data, the fact that the public is irrational and emotional, and comes to the complete opposite conclusion.
What's his argument?
He says, look, public policy is a mess. It's completely erratic. We are wasting billions of dollars and misallocating vital resources because we are constantly reacting to irrational public fears. He calls them populist excesses.
So he sees the public's fear not as a valid signal of values, but as a dangerous source of noise.
Precisely. Sunstein believes that experts should act as a bulwark, a shield against these irrational fears. He's a huge advocate for strict cost-benefit analysis. He believes we should make decisions based on objective measures, lives saved, and the dollar cost of the economy.
He thinks these things can be measured objectively, whereas Slovic sees them as subjective.
That's the core of their disagreement. Sunstein believes that poor regulation or misdirected regulation kills people just as surely as no regulation. This is the concept he calls statistical murder.
Statistical murder, that's a strong phrase.
It's meant to be.
Yeah.
The idea is this. If we spend, say, $5 billion cleaning up a toxic waste site that isn't actually hurting anyone, just because people are scared of it, that is $5 billion we didn't spend on prenatal care or highway safety or developing new vaccines.
Things where we know it would save lives.
Right. By misallocating resources to soothe irrational fears, we are, in effect, letting other people die who could have been saved. That's the statistical murder. We can't see their faces, but they're just as dead.
So Sunstein's goal is to insulate decision makers from the pressure of the emotional mob. He wants the numbers to drive the bus, not the panic.
Exactly. He views the public's fear as a dangerous bias that needs to be filtered out so the signal, the cold, hard data can be heard.
This leads us to a concept that Sunstein and a collaborator, Timur Kuran, developed to explain how these public fears spiral out of control and start to dictate policy. They call it the availability cascade.
This is a critical concept for understanding the modern news cycle. It explains how a small, maybe insignificant event can explode into a national panic that forces the government's hand.
Okay, break it down for us. What are the steps of an availability cascade?
It's a self-sustaining chain of events. It usually starts with a minor event. Something happens that is perhaps a little unusual or scary, and it gets a little bit of media attention.
Step 1, the minor event and initial reporting.
Step 2, the media reports it. Because it's scary or novel, it gets attention. That creates availability. More people are now thinking about it.
Step 3.
The public gets worried. That's the emotional reaction, the effect heuristic kicking in. Now, here's the key to the cascade. The worry itself becomes the story. The media sees that people are clicking, watching, and talking about this thing. So they produce more coverage, but this time about the public's reaction.
The headlines shift from thing X happened to people are panicked about thing X.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which, of course, makes more people panic. It validates their fear. It's a feedback loop. And then you have what Sunstein and Curran call availability entrepreneurs.
I love that term, availability entrepreneurs. It sounds like a Silicon Valley job title.
It does, doesn't it?
Mm.
But these are activists or politicians or even media personalities who see the growing panic and deliberately feed the cycle. They jump on the bandwagon to push their own agenda, knowing that the public is primed to listen.
They monetize the fear.
They monetize the fear, either for votes, for donations, for ratings, or to push a specific piece of legislation. They become the champions of the panic.
And what's the consequence of this cascade once it really gets going?
The consequence is that the issue becomes the #1 political priority, regardless of the actual data. And if you are a scientist or a skeptic who tries to stand up and say, hey, everyone, let's calm down, the data doesn't really support this level of panic, you get punished.
You're accused of a cover-up or being a shill for industry.
You're seen as heartless. You're part of the problem. So rational dissent is silenced. Politicians, who are very good at sensing the direction of the wind, react to the intensity of the public sentiment, not the facts. They don't want to get voted out.
So they pass a new law, create a new agency.
And resources are moved toward the loud risk, ignoring other, quieter, but potentially much deadlier problems.
The source material gives 2 really specific historical examples of this in action. The first one is Love Canal in 1979. I remember hearing about this, but refresh us on the details.
Love Canal was a neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York, that was built near a buried toxic waste site from a chemical company. In a particularly rainy season in 1979, the waste started getting exposed. There were foul smells, and black sludge started seeping into people's basements.
I mean, that sounds like a legitimate horror movie. I'd be terrified.
Absolutely. And the residents were rightfully terrified. An availability entrepreneur emerged, a resident and activist named Lois Gibbs. She was incredibly effective at organizing the community and sustaining media interest in the problem.
So the cascade kicked in.
It went into overdrive. There were daily news stories. ABC News aired a primetime program called The Killing Ground. And the imagery was just incredibly potent. The source mentions empty, baby-sized coffins being paraded in front of the state legislature.
Visually incredibly powerful. You can't argue with a baby coffin. That's high availability, high emotion.
No, you can't. It's an emotional trump card. The result of all this pressure was the Circle legislation, which you probably know better as the Superfund. It led to massive government spending to clean up toxic sites all over the country.
So on the surface, that sounds like a success story. A community fought back and got the government to act. Was it a bad thing?
Well, this is where it gets very controversial, and you can see the Sunstein versus Slovic debate in a nutshell. Environmentalists and activists call Love Canal a disaster, but a victory for activism. But Sunstein and Curran view it as a pseudo-event.
A pseudo-event? What does that mean?
They argue that the claims of actual widespread health damage like elevated cancer rates or birth defects were never really substantiated by rigorous, large-scale scientific studies. They suggest that the massive amount of money spent on Superfund cleanups could have saved many more lives if it had been directed toward other priorities, like disease prevention or traffic safety.
That is a tough pill to swallow. It feels so cold, but I can see the brutal logic of it. If you have a limited bucket of money, you want to save the most lives you can.
But you can't tell a mother living next to toxic sludge that her fear isn't a priority because the numbers aren't bad enough yet.
That's the core of the conflict right there. Is the fear itself a harm that needs to be fixed, or is it a distraction from the real harms?
Exactly.
Let's look at the second case study from the sources, the LR scare of 1989. This one feels even more like a pure panic, less grounded in reality than Love Canal.
LR was a chemical, a growth regulator, that was sprayed on apples to regulate their growth and make them look redder and shinier for the supermarket shelf.
I remember this. My mom wouldn't buy apple juice for months. I was so mad.
Your mom wasn't alone. The scare began with press stories, most famously a segment on 60 Minutes, claiming that LR caused cancerous tumors in lab rats.
Right, but the dose was the key, wasn't it? The rats were given gigantic doses.
Massive, massive doses. The equivalent of a human drinking thousands of gallons of apple juice every single day for their entire life. But that crucial piece of context, the denominator, was completely lost.
The story just became apples cause cancer.
That was the headline. The cascade took over. It dominated the news. The actress Meryl Streep testified before Congress about the dangers.
You know it's a big deal when Meryl Streep is testifying before Congress.
The panic was visceral. The source mentions that citizens were calling the EPA, asking if they should pour their apple juice down the drain or if they needed to take it to a toxic waste dump.
That is just pure insanity.
The result was that the product was banned and the apple industry lost hundreds of millions of dollars.
And the reality check, what was the actual risk?
The risk was tiny, almost negligible. In fact, the source material makes the stunning point that the net effect on public health was likely negative.
Wait, how could that be? Banning a potentially cancerous chemical had a negative health effect.
Because people stopped eating apples. Apples are incredibly healthy. They're full of fiber and vitamins that prevent cancer and heart disease. The irrational fear caused people to avoid a very healthy food, which, on a population level, is almost certainly worse for you than the tiny, tiny risk from the chemical.
That is a perfect and terrifying example of what the experts call probability neglect.
Yes. The R case shows that as humans, we are terrible at dealing with very small risks. We either ignore them completely or we give them massive disproportionate weight. There is no middle ground in our brains.
We focus on the numerator, the tragic story, the image of the rat with the tumor, and we completely ignore the denominator, the millions and millions of apples eaten safely every day.
Exactly. As Slovic argues, the amount of concern we feel is not sensitive to the probability of harm. We imagine the tragedy and the math goes right out the window.
No. We can't talk about fear and availability and these emotional cascades without talking about the ultimate trigger for System 1 thinking.
Terrorism.
Terrorism. It feels like it was designed in a lab to exploit all these glitches in our thinking.
It is, in many ways, the perfect storm for these psychological mechanisms. You could argue that modern terrorism is less about military strategy and more about psychological warfare. It's engineered to hack our brains.
The stats are pretty clear, right? I mean, unless you're talking about a massive singular event like 9/11, the number of casualties from terrorism is very, very low compared to other things that kill us.
Extremely low.
Yeah.
The source mentions that even in countries that have faced intensive terror campaigns, like Israel during the Intifadas, the weekly number of casualties from terrorism almost never came close to the number of people killed in traffic accidents in that same week.
But nobody is afraid of their car in the same way.
No. Because the car is familiar, we feel like we're in control. We tell ourselves, I'm a good driver, I can handle this. Terrorism is the opposite. It's malicious, it's random, it's visual.
And the availability is just off the charts.
The gruesome images are endlessly repeated on a 24-hour news cycle. A car crash is a local story. A terror attack is a global event. It speaks directly to our primal brain, our System 1. You can't reason yourself into calm when you see those images over and over.
So it creates a state where everyone is constantly on edge.
And this state of fear leads to massive shifts in resources. We create entire government agencies like the TSA, we start wars, we change our laws about privacy and surveillance, all to fight a risk that statistically is very small for the average person.
We spend trillions of dollars to calm our System 1.
Often while ignoring the boring, high-probability risks like heart disease or diabetes that are actually killing us in huge numbers.
So we've painted a pretty bleak picture of a human brain that is easily hacked by emotion and vivid stories. We've talked about a public policy process that is often driven by panic rather than data. Where does the author of our source material come down on all this? How do we balance this mess of democracy and rationality?
The author attempts a synthesis, which I think is the most interesting part of the whole discussion. He actually ends up agreeing with both Sunstein and Slovic.
So he sits on the fence?
No, I think he builds a bridge. He agrees with Sunstein that availability cascades are real and they are a serious problem. They distort our priorities. They waste incredible amounts of money. We shouldn't let irrational panic dictate the national budget.
But there's a but.
But he also agrees with Slovic that you cannot simply ignore widespread fear in a democracy. A government's job isn't just to manage statistics, it's to govern people.
Because the fear itself is a cost. Is that the idea?
Exactly. Fear is painful. It is debilitating. It is a form of suffering. If the public is terrified of toxic waste, even if the statistical risk is low, that terror is a real problem that the government has a duty to address. You can't just tell people, your feelings are wrong, shut up and look at my spreadsheet.
That just erodes trust and makes everything worse.
It makes everything worse. So policymakers have to protect the public from fear, not just from the real statistical danger. It's a dual mandate.
And he also mentions a silver lining to all this, right? That sometimes these cascades can actually be useful.
Yes, he argues that availability cascades, for all their messiness, can serve to wake society up to a real but neglected problem. Look at Love Canal again. Even if the specific health claims were exaggerated, and even if the cleanup was inefficient, it raised the priority of environmental concerns globally.
It put toxic waste on the map.
It absolutely did. It made us care about what we as a society were putting in the ground. It forced a conversation that wasn't happening before.
So sometimes we need a little irrational panic to generate the political will to do the right thing in the long run.
That seems to be the argument. Democracy is messy. It is guided by these biased heuristics. But that's the reality we live in. The goal of psychology shouldn't be to replace democracy with a panel of experts, but to help us design policies that combine the experts' knowledge with the public's intuition and values.
We need the data, but we also have to respect the emotions and the values of the people.
It has to be a partnership, not a dictatorship of reason.
That is a really powerful place to land. It's not about suppressing emotion, but about understanding it and working with it.
Exactly.
Before we sign off, I want to leave our listener with one final thought. Something to carry with you when you open your newsfeed or turn on the TV tomorrow morning.
What's that?
We talked about that term availability entrepreneurs. The people who profit politically, financially, or socially by deliberately keeping a specific frightening image right in the front of your mind.
That is a crucial lens to use when you consume media.
So when you see the headlines, when you feel that jolt of fear or anger, just take a second and ask yourself, who is benefiting from me being afraid of this right now? Is this a genuine statistical reality, or is someone surfing an availability cascade for their own gain?
Are you looking at the data, or are you just staring at the scary reflection in your own mind?
And always, always try to check the denominator. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
See you next time.